morning and afternoon, everyone. I am Priya, research scholar at the Department of English, University of Allahabad. I heartily welcome you all in this plenary session of the third international conference of the World Association of Authors and Researchers on the subject Decolonization through Language and Literature, organized by the Department of English, University Limerick Sheikh Hamidou Khan, Senegal, in association with Senegal Chapter West Africa and Prayagraj Chapter India of WAAR. I welcome our eminent speakers today, Dr. Cheikh Nguirane from University of French West Indies, Martinique, and Professor Patrícia Ferraz de Matos for Lusófona University, Lisbon, Portugal, and our third speaker, Professor David Webster from Buckinghamshire University, United Kingdom. We are pleased to invite you all and our participants to have an enlightening session today. At first, I invite Dr. Cheikh Nguirane for his illuminating ideas on the topic linguistic Pan-Africanism, an often ignored dimension of Pan-African studies. Dr. Cheikh is an associate professor in Anglophone studies at the University of French West Indies. He has previously held positions of the University of Limoges, the University of Ferraz, and University of Orleans and Acadia. His research interests include African diaspora, Pan-African ideas and circulations, and Black political of articles. He has published a number of articles pertaining to the African diaspora and engaged with media outlets and the US politics. He currently serves as co-editor of the Journal of African and African Diasporic Studies, Harriet Tubman Institute at York University. We welcome you, sir, for sharing your informative ideas regarding the topic. Your session, please take us the session and the platform is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. And before starting my talk, I would like to thank the organizers of this international conference. It is an honor for me to be invited as a speaker. When my colleague, Dr. Alessandra, reached out to me for the conference, I was very excited because I knew this is a platform where you can meet scholars from the global south, from the global north. And speaking about decolonization, we still wonder whether it is still relevant. I am not taking the same position as Olufumi Taiwo, you already know, who is from Nigeria, who wrote a book entitled Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously. I do take African agency seriously, but I am not approaching decolonization in the same way. So thank you for organizing this event, and I would like to bring my own contribution based on my research interest. As you have heard it in the presentation, I work on Pan-Africanism and African diaspora studies. That is the focus of my research for a number of years. What I do in studying Pan-Africanism is to take another approach. I am not mostly focusing on African unity, as we see the mainstream scholarship. I do not only focus on Pan-Africanism as a movement, it is also an idea. And part of my work focuses on the idea. And when you focus on the idea, you would see a lot of ramifications. The ramification of Pan-Africanism, we see the linguistic dimension. That's where my talk lies. When I decided to talk about linguistic Pan-Africanism, it also builds on a project that I call the Isms of Africa. The Isms of Africa are divided into, I would say, two parts. The isms of oppression, like colonialism, racism, white supremacism, and so on. But also the isms of liberation. Pan-Africanism is part of the isms of liberation. So I built on this project to really examine how linguistic Pan-Africanism manifested. When we mention linguistic Pan-Africanism, we might say this is just an attempt to find one common language for African countries in order to achieve unity. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond that. What I can say is the language issue has been embedded in Pan-Africanism in the early 19th century. There are early Pan-African figures we do not mostly mention that embraced the language question. But their position was in some kind of contradiction when we consider the decolonization movement today. Because at the beginning, they were not rejecting English. The question was whether English was wide enough, welcoming enough to take the weight of the aspiration. That was the question at the beginning. They were not rejecting English as a language that was not relevant enough because there was no other way to communicate, but they believed English could be a language that could carry their messages. And they were drawing on liberal humanism, but also on secularism to continue to express their views of the world. So Pan-Africanism as both a movement and an idea has been extensively studied, as you can read it in my abstract. From the 20th century Pan-African Congresses, the Pan-African Congresses happened in many colonial metropolises. You already know, Paris, London, Lisbon, Brussels, New York, and then Manchester in 1945. That was the last gathering of African intellectuals and diaspora intellectuals. That was, I would say, the rupture that most historians have studied, and then it moved on the continent. When it moved on the continent, that Pan-Africanism was now translated into African unity. That's when we lost part of the narrative. And part of my work is to reconsider the narrative, to say that Pan-Africanism is not just about African unity, but it has many ramifications, among them linguistics. So what I can say is from Henry Sylvester Williams, his name resonates everywhere when we talk about Pan-Africanism. William Du Bois, we already know him. His name resonates everywhere as the father of Pan-Africanism. But also we have Kwame Kumar, who embraced Pan-Africanism, but his Pan-Africanism was just in political and economic terms. And he was very involved in scholarly Pan-Africanism. Scholarly Pan-Africanism was that he put in place the Afrikaner Encyclopedia because he invited Du Bois to stay in Ghana in order to write down that encyclopedia. That was a way to compete with the other European encyclopedia we already know. But also he was the one who organized the first Africanist International Conference because he believed scholars could advance the unity of Africa, but he was not embracing the language issues. So just to say a few things about traditional Pan-Africanism, the pillars that I would say include political liberation, economic integration, and cultural pride. These are the three pillars of Pan-Africanism. And language, but also language runs through all the pillars that I just mentioned. Economic, political, cultural, language runs through all of them. But the problem is it is not taken as an analytical category. That is where my conception of linguistic Pan-Africanism lies. Conceptualizing linguistic Pan-Africanism, I would say, in decolonization terms, it is a critical and epistemological approach aimed at challenging the dominant narratives about Africa embedded in European languages, as well as promoting an African linguistic agency as a vehicle for a shared continental and diaspora consciousness. That is the main definition that I would provide for linguistic Pan-Africanism. And linguistic Pan-Africanism, it builds on the assumption that European languages are permeated by dominant imaginaries, institutionalized forms of meaning and epistemologies. So why it is ignored? Some scholars have already mentioned political convenience, because, going back to take an indigenous language to do politics in international relations would be so challenging, even if many attempts exist in our countries to revive our indigenous languages. I know that the promotion of African languages as instruments of continental unity, self-determination, and epistemic decolonization resonates in many Pan-African debates. And a lot of questions has been asked. Among them, is linguistic unity a precondition for Pan-African unity, or can we just build on multilingual solidarity? I would say, is multilingualism enough to sustain Pan-African thought and practices? That is the question, and it is a debate still going on. A last question would be, can Pan-African unity be complete without African elites and institutions continue to operate in foreign languages? That is a question. So in this talk, I specifically consider linguistic Pan-Africanism as part of the Pan-African intellectual tradition. It is part of the Pan-African intellectual tradition. First, I will consider how a few Black intellectuals, including Alexander Crummell, an African-American, and part of the Back to Africa movement. And he was the founder of the American Negro I would say Institute. And I would say how Alexander Crummell, Kwasi Pra, who is from Ghana, a very interesting scholar, how they differed on the English language ability to serve as a purveyor of liberal humanist ideals and carry the weight of African people's experiences and aspirations. The second point would be, I will examine linguistic Pan-Africanism as an expression of solidarity and epistemologic sovereignty. And I look for answers within contemporary Pan-African works and advocacies of Senegalese renowned scholar, Cheikh Anta Diop, focusing on his insistence on African languages as vehicle of scientific thought. I would also consider the late Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. We paid tribute to him yesterday, and I truly appreciated that. His call to decolonizing the mind. I would also focus on the Asmara Declaration. The Asmara Declaration is most of the time, like I would say, approach in literature. But if we consider the link with Pan-Africanism, we would see that it is part of this tradition. So for the historical precedents, I just mentioned Alexander Crummell. Alexander Crummell is part of those African-American leaders who advocated back to Africa way before Marcus Garvey. But their back to Africa was quite different. They embraced, I would say, some colonial mentality mindset, because their way of going to Africa was maybe they would be closer, culturally speaking, to the people of Africa so that they can bring their own contribution to the continent in terms of technology, in terms of agriculture, but also in terms of religion, bringing religion on the continent. And Alexander Crummell was one of these leaders. He championed Pan-Africanism, and he's considered by the German historian, whose name is Immanuel Geiss, he's considered as a proto-Pan-Africanist. A proto-Pan-Africanist. I don't like the word, quite speaking, but he is part of the fathers of Pan-Africanism, Alexander Crummell, along other leaders that I can mention. And he's known as the pioneer. He's known as the pioneer, and early on, he wrote an article from a talk and questioning English as the language. And he was questioning English as the language to see whether his quest for freedom for all African people could be based on the English language. And he was convinced that the fight for freedom could be reinforced by the conceptual power of the English language. He was very, really, I would say, convinced the conceptual power of the English language to do that work. So in Cromwell's views, Pan-African solidarity was made possible in part by the expansion of the socio-political vocabulary in English, the socio-political vocabulary in English. And if English has facilitated the introduction of concepts that are central to freedom, it also must be emphasized that it has been exclusively within the confines of Western liberal doctrines. That has to be acknowledged. But what I can say is, Alexander Cromwell, like other Pan-African figures, Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was in Liberia, and he migrated because of the American Colonization Society. James Africanus Horton also. These two figures, they embraced the English language, but it was their time. It was their time, and they were sometimes considered as very, in their position, very contradicting arguments in their way of expressing freedom and emancipation. So now, from the decolonization period, because I really jumped from the 19th century to the 1950s, because that would be a long process for me to reflect on, I just decided to move on from Alexander Cromwell, Edward Wilmot Blyden, to the 1950s. The 1950s is significant in the way I approach linguistic Pan-Africanism. So from that period, the needs of African people shifted. It shifted. And there was a need to break with the colonial system. The hegemony of European languages was called into question. One example is the Second Congress of African Writers and Artists held in Rome, Italy, in 1959. That event features the language issue. The language question was central to this conference that brought many intellectuals. And it was the same structure as the Pan-African Congresses held in colonial metropolises. It was the same structure. And at the end of the conference, they established many proposals, resolution, I would say, as it happened in the Pan-African Congresses. So they advocated for the adoption, first, of Kiswahili, the language of continental Pan-Africanism, and they were citing Cheikh Anta Diop to support arguments. And Wole Soyinka was one of those prominent African writers and intellectuals who was supporting this idea of moving forward with that African linguistic agency. So as most of the African language among the diaspora, and particularly in African Americans, there is a general consensus that Kiswahili should be. And the debate is still going on. We might consider Kiswahili being the continental language as something that is recent, but it goes beyond that period. So by adopting Swahili as the language of instruction in its schools, Tanzania was able to demonstrate that it was possible. And there's a great book by a scholar who wanted to say that Pan-African education is a must. Pan-African education is a must. And the central argument in that book is that the language issue needs to be taken seriously. Unless we teach, govern, think, and dream in African languages, there is no way we can break the chain of domination. That is the main argument of that book. And he also advocated for the institution of an African university that has to be established in Central Africa. And that should be embracing all the African languages. It is not an advocacy of rejecting all European languages, but make sure that the European languages carry the aspiration of African people and should not be a vehicle for domination on the world stage. So the Congress of African Writers and Artists in Europe was a major argument, but also let me focus on Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon has touched on the language issue, whether it can carry the weight and aspiration of the peoples of Africa. But Frantz Fanon was quite clear because he was not into essentialism. And even his position on race is quite different from the position of many African intellectuals. Frantz Fanon, he says, at the beginning of the aspiration for decolonization, what we call in French arabité, being Arabic, was put forward as culturally relevant. But what happened was, like the dimension, but also the stakes of the fight against the French colonial system could not be supported by the Arabic language. So they switched to French. So what they did was to reappropriate the French language in order to advance their struggle. And Frantz Fanon is quite clear about that, to say that I know language is an instrumental tool to subjugate people that has been colonized, but at the end of the day, language can also be used to defend a position against the master, using the same tools as the masters to defend that position. Let me move on from Frantz Fanon to Kwesi Pra that I mentioned in my early introduction. Kwesi Pra I discovered a few years ago when I was researching the Pan-African intellectual tradition. What I mean by the Pan-African intellectual tradition is the bridge between African American studies and African studies. There is a bridge. If you combine African American studies and African studies, you would see what it means to say Pan-African intellectual tradition. I know that institutionally speaking, they are separate. I know that from a pedagogical point of view, they are separate. But if you go back to the works of Du Bois, to the work of Carter G. Woodson, to the works of other African American intellectuals, but also to see the works of African post-colonial writers and intellectuals, would see the link. The link is quite clear. And that link that I call the Pan-African intellectual tradition. And Kwesi Pra is part of that lineage. He's part of that lineage. His perspective on language is quite different. He touches on education, but also on epistemology. And he's a Ghanaian. He's from Ghana. He was hired in South Africa. He was hired in South Africa as a professor. And in South Africa, he studied to see how the many languages, Xhosa, Zulu, and so on, can be combined. He was leading a scientific work, and he was following the same steps as Cheikh Anta Diop that I'm going to mention later. The same steps. He wanted to see whether the many languages can have a meeting ground. And he was creating a cluster of languages, and create an alphabet and standardized teaching. That was his aim. It was scientific. Because he believed unless we have that language that brings together all these cultures in the same country, there is no way to continue to advocate for decolonization, to make decolonization a reality. So, and he created the Center for Advanced Studies of African Society in 1997 in Cape Town. And that was the main platform for his Pan-African advocacy. But most of the Pan-African scholarship do not mention them as Pan-African leaders, because Pan-Africanism has been confined on the political arena. You have to be Kwame Nkrumah. You have to be Sékou Touré of Guinea. You have to be Patrice Lumumba. You have to be Thomas Sankara. But there are many hidden figures of Pan-Africanism we do not mostly mention. And that's why I see Kwesi Pra as an intellectual who embraced Pan-Africanism in considering the linguistic dimension. And what is interesting is Kwasi Pra adapted the conception of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah wrote a book that is well known all over the world. The book is entitled Consensusism, Philosophy and Ideology for Decolonization. And the book was reviewed by many African scholars, among them Ali Mazrui. Ali Mazrui, who is from Kenya, he was considered, the late Ali Mazrui, who was considered as controversial, but Ali Mazrui, he conceptualized the triple heritages that was drawn from the book of Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah says that many critics are that we cannot unite. We cannot unite because if we consider the incompatibility of the traditional African culture, the Islamic influence, and the Euro-Christian and colonial influence, these three heritages combined cannot lead to unity. And Nkrumah says, no, I can work on a unified ideology that is consensusism. And that unified ideology would lead to the path of Pan-Africanism. That was consensusism. And Kwasi Pra adopted the same logic to say that the assumption that the African continent is too fractured by its 1,000 indigenous languages is not something he would embrace, and he called it the myth of the African Tower of Babel. He says, no, there is no way we should accept the idea that because you have thousands of languages, there is no way for unity. So we can go beyond those diversity and move on for unity. So, and he worked on standardized systems, and which culminated in his institution. And finally, Kwasi Pra engaged in a process of intellectualization of African languages. Intellectualization of African languages in the same way as Cheikh Anta Diop. He wanted to demonstrate how African languages can be carrying the message of scientific studies. Because the many European linguists and other studies in the African scholarship has rejected the validity of African languages to carry the message of science and technology. Even if it is still challenging in many African countries, some scholarship do mention another possibility, an alternative. And Kwasi Pra is one of those who considered that intellectualization is a process of expanding the language vocabulary and structural capacity so it can be used to teach advanced science, engineering, law, and technology. So, and he was finding words in the Xhosa language in South Africa to mention how it can be expanded all over the continent. So, and he argues that no society which is scientifically and technologically advancing is achieving this on the basis of a language foreign to its people. Let me repeat. No society which is scientifically and technologically advancing is achieving this on the basis of a language foreign to its people. So that was the core argument of Kwasi Pra. And one of his books is quite clear on the issue. The book is one of his publications that is Beyond the Color Line, Pan-Africanist Disputations. And he wants to connect language with the Pan-African liberation and cultural renaissance. And he's not the only one that I could mention, but based on the number of minutes that I have, I would jump on to another intellectual in order to back my idea of linguistic Pan-Africanism. And also, in one of his books that is quite relevant in terms of education, he says that African languages should be for the masses, should be used for the mass education of Africans. For the mass education of Africans, and he argues that language bears all the imprints and expresses the history of its users. No single area of culture is as revealing of the history of its users as language. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o repeated Kwasi-Pra. A few years later, Ngugi wa Thiong'o copied, I would say not copied, but embraced the same idea of using a language to carry the memory of a people. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o is quite radical in defending African languages, even if he was not really taken seriously when he called for the decolonization of the English language, but also the English department, and also decolonizing the mind. So now, my case study that is properly linguistic Pan-Africanism would be focusing on Cheikh Anta Diop and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and finishing with the Asmara Declaration. Cheikh Anta Diop and Ngugi wa Thiong'o were not just intellectuals writing books and articles. They were very committed in translating Pan-Africanism in the linguistic field. They were very committed into that, not just writing books and articles. And Cheikh Anta Diop, one cannot mention his linguistic Pan-Africanism without going back to his historical thesis, which has been labeled as controversial, which has been rejected all over. But in the 1980s, there is, I would say, an epistemological turn that tried to rehabilitate his contribution. One of the controversies is ancient Egypt civilization as being Black or not, whether Cleopatra was Black or not. That question is still going on in many diaspora communities, I would say that. So the core argument of Cheikh Anta Diop is that cultural unity, the cultural unity thesis, I would say, the cultural unity thesis it rests upon his research on pre-colonial Africa, and notably his ancient Egyptian civilization. And in his historical accounts, Cheikh Anta Diop contend that in prehistoric times, Africans were concentrated in the Great Lakes region. They were concentrated in the Great Lakes region. While they moved to the Nile Valley and built what was defended as the ancient Egyptian civilization, others migrated to the west and south of Africa, building the civilization of Ghana, Zimbabwe, and others. So they were migrating. As a result of that migration, there was contact, linguistic contact. And from that contact, he established a number of words to establish the parallel between different languages, to see that they have a common family. And he says a common African linguistic background, a common African linguistic background. That was the thesis of his Pan-African unity. However, Cheikh Anta Diop says colonialism now subjugated all these indigenous languages. And even though the local dialects survived, he says the African linguistic commonality was undermined completely, the experiences under colonialism required learning the European languages. Remember, at the beginning, I mentioned Alexander Cromwell, Edward Wilmot Blyden. They were using English and defending English as the language that can carry the aspiration of African people. And Cheikh Anta Diop, while acknowledging that colonialism undermined all these indigenous languages, because the condition, the context was that they required the use of these European languages in that situation. But Cheikh Anta Diop, he was really one of the figures, if I defend linguistic Pan-Africanism, one of the figures who really epitomized linguistic Pan-Africanism more than any other African scholars. And one article that I would quote to move on to Ngugi is, when can we talk of an African Renaissance? When can we talk of an African Renaissance? That's a great article. And he questioned African literature. Well, I am not trying to oppose Cheikh Anta Diop to Senghor. We already know that history, one calling the poet as ridiculous when trying to describe the flowers somewhere in mainland France that doesn't speak to the African, ridiculing Senghor for his poetry. I'm not into that, but he questioned the African literature and European languages. And he's not the only one. He's not the only one. Ngugi did that. But he was arguing that it is absolutely indispensable to destroy the attachment to the prestige of European languages in the greater interest of Africa. That's Cheikh Anta Diop saying. He also says the development of our indigenous languages is the prerequisite for a real African Renaissance. Cheikh Anta Diop was a Pan-Africanist, and he was not hiding. His advocacy is quite clear, and anytime we mention language in the Pan-African debate, all thoughts goes to Cheikh Anta Diop. And Ngugi was not really confined in the Pan-African arena, which I find really unjust to me. It is injustice. I have the debate with other colleagues that Ngugi wa Thiong'o is not just a writer. There are many books of Ngugi wa Thiong'o focusing on Pan-Africanism that was published later in the early 1990s and also later in the early 2000s. And there's one book that I'm going to mention that is quite about Pan-Africanism, but that disappeared because we read Ngugi as a novelist mostly. So following Cheikh Anta Diop, Ngugi, I would say that Ngugi is part of those intellectuals, I would say a Pan-Africanist across the African continent who advocated linguistic decolonization as a means of reducing the hegemony of languages inherited from the imperial tradition. And Ngugi repeatedly argued through his novels and lectures that the predominance of colonial languages was crucial to the colonization of minds. And the radical decolonization process he proposed involves a systematic refusal to submit to the worldview associated with the English language and the anchoring of indigenous languages in the cultural and intellectual life of African people, which explains his effort to write in the Gikuyu language. A lot of criticism from the European scholarship is that it was pure utopia. It was not possible for any African writer to write in African languages, in African languages and make their voices heard on the global arena. That's a criticism that is quite harsh to challenge, but what I can say is Ngugi in his book entitled Something Torn and New, an African Renaissance. And this is a long quotation that I would like to quote because it is quite relevant in the debate we are having until today. Let me quote: writers, artists, musicians, intellectuals, and workers in ideas are the keepers of memory of a community. What fate awaits a community when its keepers of memory have been subjugated to the West linguistic means of production and storage of memory? English, French, and Portuguese, such that those who should have been keepers of the same sacred word now see themselves and the different possibilities for the community only within the linguistic boundaries of memory incorporated. We have languages, but our keepers of memory feel that they cannot store knowledge, emotions, and intellect in African languages. It is like possessing a granary. It is like possessing a granary, but at harvest, storing your produces in somebody else's granary. The result is 90% of intellectual production in Africa is stored in European languages, a continuation of the colonial project in which not even a single treaty between Europe and Africa exists in any African language. So look for Africa in African languages and you will not find her. So the last lines are quite interesting. The result is 90% of intellectual production in Africa is stored in European languages, a continuation of the colonial project in which not even a single treaty between Europe and Africa exists in any African language, So look for Africa in African languages and you will not find her. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o truly embraced linguistic Pan-Africanism. Just let me know if ever you find that I'm going beyond the time limit, let me know quite clearly. So I just have a few lines to go. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o also criticizes the treatment of African languages in foreign institutions. And that part of Ngugi's scholarship is quite interesting. He was even criticizing international institutions. And he did the same as one researcher that was very known in the institute that is called Kodesria, Issa Shivji. Issa Shivji wrote a book about human rights, the language of human rights. And he's questioning the power of words or the relevance of words to carry the message of Africans. It is a quite interesting book. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o also criticizes the way African languages were treated in international institutions. He argues that the main cause is the marginalization of African languages within continental academic institutions. What is critical is Ngugi is blaming African universities for marginalizing African languages. That's Ngugi saying that. In his view, the construction of knowledge about Africa based on European American languages is part of the process by which Africa continues to be understood through a Western linguistic lens. This process, which he calls Europhonism, Ngugi called this process Europhonism, and is a parasitic enterprise that only knows how to take away but never give back anything to the language and people in whose name it claims its place in the global community of researchers in the arts, science, and technology. That's Ngugi saying that. So now Ngugi wa Thiong'o is central to the idea of linguistic Pan-Africanism, not just as the promotion of one single African language for African unity. Ngugi goes beyond that. He is more than a novelist, but his later writings reveals a lot about Ngugi's preoccupation with the African continent. And his latest books are quite revealing about his position in the Pan-African horizon. Now, to finish with this talk, I would focus on the Asmara Declaration. The Asmara Declaration is quite quoted in literature. It happened in 2000 in Eritrea on the African continent, and it was a declaration on African languages and literatures. And I truly believe my colleagues in literature might not see it as Pan-Africanism, but I truly believe it is part of the Pan-African tradition. And it follows the tradition of the Congress of African Writers and Artists, one held in Paris and then second in Italy. And at the previous Pan-African Congresses, it brought together writers and academics from across Africa and the diaspora. The conference aimed to revisit the state of African languages in the field of literature, research, publishing, education, and administration in Africa and around the world. It was rooted in the tradition of the Black writers. The conference also reflected on the ongoing struggle for the decolonization of knowledge. You know, we have been preaching decolonial literature
Excuse me, sir.
over the last, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but because we are getting out of time, so please conclude it within 1 or 2 minutes.
1 minute is enough. 1 minute is
Yes.
enough.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So the conference of Asmara resulted in 10 related proposals that I'm not going to mention, but 3 of them are relevant to the idea of linguistic Pan-Africanism. They say African languages must assume the duty, responsibility, and challenge of speaking for the continent. First, linguistic agency, that is Pan-Africanism. All African children have the inalienable rights, maybe copying the American Constitution, maybe, I don't know, to attend schools and learn in their mother tongue. To this end, every effort must be made to develop African languages at all levels of education. And finally, promoting research through African languages is essential for their development, especially since the advancement of research and documentation on the African world will be better served by the use of these languages. This was a few elements I wanted to share on the issue of linguistic Pan-Africanism, which is quite broad, but I hope that it might open the door for further discussion. And again, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for this platform to share ideas on various parts of the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightening views. We really learned a lot from this session on linguistic Pan-Africanism. From Alexander Cromwell to Du Bois and to Franz Fanon, we discussed many ideas intertwined together. And this session was structured in such a way that it was really helpful for us to understand lots of complicated ideas together with lots of clarity together. So you truly mentioned the fact that the language should not be the vehicle of operation and subjugation. Rather, it should be the tool of self-expression, one's identity and freedom. So I thank you so much I thank you on the behalf of all listeners for this great session. And now it's time to move ahead with our next speaker, Professor Patrícia Ferraz de Matos from Lisbon University, Lisbon, Portugal. So,
thank you.
Professor Patrícia is an anthropologist and integrated researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Education and Development Studies. Since 2026, within the framework of the FCT institutional call for stimulate scientific employment, she was an auxiliary researcher from 2019 to 25 and postdoctoral researcher from 2013 to 19 at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Lisbon, and is the member of teaching staff of the PhD program in anthropology at the University of Lisbon since 2013. He has collaborated with several Portuguese and international universities at undergraduate and postgraduate level and has supervised numerous cases. He is an associate editor of the Anthropological Journal of European Cultures, 2022 to present itself, coordinator of the Europeanist network of the EAS8 from 2020 to 2026, deputy director of Analyst Social, and since 2025 is secretary-elect of the Society for the Anthropology of Europe, African Anthropological Association. He is also fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland since 2019, and was a member of the advisory board of the International Association of Social Sciences and Humanities of Portuguese Language, representing the meritorious members at University of Lisbon from 2021 to 25. He has published 38 articles in peer-reviewed journal and 12 papers in proceedings. He has published 28 book chapters and 4 books. He has co-edited 1 book and co-edited 10 special issues. He has organized 68 events and supervised several doctoral theses. Today, we are welcoming her for her enlightening session on the topic, Exercise for Decolonizing Thought and Practice Today, Examples Related to Portuguese Case. We welcome you, ma'am, and we are very eager to listen your point of views on this topic. The platform is yours.
Hello, good morning. So I prepared a PowerPoint. I think I can share my screen. I will try to do that. So let me see. So are you seeing my presentation?
Yeah,
yes,
it's visible.
Yes.
I'm not visible myself, but maybe it's not necessary. Okay. But are you seeing my PowerPoint right now?
Yes,
We
ma'am.
can see
Yes,
your
ma'am.
PowerPoint and a small image of you as well.
Yes, so I will start my presentation, okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, so firstly, I would like to thank Professor Vijay Kumar Roy, President of the World Association of Authors and Researchers, for his kind invitation to deliver this conference. It's both an honor and a great responsibility. I would also like to extend my greetings to the academic community of the Université Numérique Cheikh Hamidou Kane, the host of this event in Senegal, a country that has been at the heart of profound reflections on the African condition and human emancipation. Dear colleagues, researchers, and authors, the theme of this year's Third International Conference of the World Association of Authors and Researchers is very timely. Thinking about decolonization through language and literature is important in both the political and epistemological fields. Speaking to an audience primarily composed of intellectuals, thinkers, and creators from Africa and India is in itself a decentrate exercise. The title I proposed for this conference is Exercises for Decolonizing Thought and Practice Today, Examples Related to the Portuguese Case. As an anthropologist and historian specializing in the study of European colonialism, museum collections, and their contemporary legacies, I intend to reverse the traditional route of discursive authority through my presence. Talking about colonialism has never been, nor will it ever be, an easy task. Rather than bringing the perspective of the colonial metropolis that dictates the rules of universal knowledge, I will present a theoretical and practical exercise that takes the former metropolis, Portugal in this case, as the object of analysis and dissection. Whenever we attempt to challenge dominant narratives about the imperial past, we must be prepared to take a courageous stance, occupy an uncomfortable position, and risk comments or criticism. I will analyze a recently inaugurated museum exhibition in Lisbon, examining its discourse, language, and silences, as well as the controversy surrounding its existence. All the images integrated in my presentation came from the book, the catalog of that exhibition, with 360 pages. My argument is that decolonization of contemporary practices requires confrontation of current hostility and hate speech for the promotion of true historical justice. To structure a non-Eurocentric theoretical framework through which we can understand the complexity of contemporary museological and representational practices, it is important to consider the voices marginalized by the Western social science canon. Over 60 years ago, anti-colonial leaders in Asia and Africa developed conceptual tools that we can still use today. Leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, Amilcar Cabral, and Edward Mondlane were not just military strategies. They were intelligent individuals with academic backgrounds in the social sciences. However, their theoretical of Amilcar Cabral is agronomic and sociopolitical analysis of the social structures of India and Cape Verde ended up constituting a pioneering treatise on critical sociology. These thinkers demonstrated how the colonial project was not exhausted in the plunder of resources or in extractivism or in military occupation, Its effectiveness was fundamentally in the colonization of minds. As these leaders pointed out, colonialism developed an engineering of epistemological and ontological inferiority, instilling in some peoples a feeling of inferiority in relation to the elites and knowledge of the colonizing countries. According to the idea of Aníbal Quijano on the coloniality of power, colonial administrations did not extinguish the colonial matrix of power, which continues to classify world populations with racial and Eurocentric criteria. In museographic terms, this matrix is evident in the persistence of collections that depict the other as existing outside of historical time. Similarly, the work of Gayatri Spivak on subalternity prompts us to question the language through which empire narrates itself. Is it possible for the subaltern to speak in a museum setting? Or is their voice always translated, domesticated, and sanitized by Western curators' interpretation? Akil Mbembe, when discussing post-colonial dynamics and the archive, reminds us that cultural institutions often celebrate death and colonial sovereignty aesthetically. The idea of Ngugi wa Thiong'o on decolonization of the mind is also important. Language and literature are not just extras, but a place where resistance is planned and where the counter-hegemonic archive is created. Although authors such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida can provide useful tools for deconstructing discourse and conducting institutional critics, their work must be approached with a critical eye. Their framework may not be applicable to the colonial thought. A more suitable framework is one that is pluripistemic, taking into account the epistemologies of the global South, as well as the reflections of those who have experienced territorial and linguistic dispossession. In the context of the role association of authors and researchers, where the focus is on decolonization through language, this axis cannot be viewed as merely a methodological tool. It is the fundamental basis of this line of thinking. Language is a territory in which coloniality is inscribed and where resistance can also be organized. In the museum space, on the other hand, language takes on a material form through museographic language and colonial terminology, which sometimes continues to persist in the captions near the pieces. We often encounter terms such as tribal, primitive, or indigenous, as well as passive-aggressive expressions that conceal the violent nature of acquisition, such as collected on campaign or offered by the colonial governor. On the other hand, it means questioning in which languages colonialism is narrated. Why does the main narrative of a European museum continue to be delivered in the colonizer's language, relating the original languages to mere folkloric footnotes or absolute absences? It is precisely here that African and Asian literatures emerged as a true counter-hegemonic archive, where the official historiography of the empire generated silence, erasure, and forgetting. Literature produced memory, human depth, and counter-discourse. Authors such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his fundamental work on the decolonization of the mind, alert us to the fact that the choice of language is a political act of the first order. For Nguirane, the rejection of the colonial language in literary creation is a refusal to submit to the conceptual universe of the colonizer. If we apply this idea to the field of museology, then literature can help decipher the silences contained in the passages of text that accompany the artifacts. Literary narratives produced in India by authors such as Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy, and in Africa by writers like Chinua Achebe Miyakoto and Paulina Chiziane, offer us a complex map of colonization. These narratives reveal the intimacy of colonial trauma, the hybridity of post-colonial identities, and the survival of worldviews that resisted Western cultural destruction. Literature achieves what the Colonial Museum was afraid to do. It restores agency to the colonized, transforming them from an object of scientific observation into a subject of historical discourse. Therefore, any practical decolonization exercise in a contemporary museum must draw on literature, integrating fiction and poetry as legitimate resources of historical truth alongside official colonial administrator reports. Inspired by some of the theoretical proposals presented earlier, I analyzed a case study. The exhibition, Deconstructing Colonialism, Decolonizing the Imaginary, Portuguese Colonialism in Africa, Myths and Realities. On display at the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon, the exhibition opened on 30 October 2024 and remains on display. It is part of the celebrations for the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution on 25 April 1974. The historical milestone marked the overthrow of fascist dictatorship in Portugal, the beginning of the country's democratization, and the end of its long colonial war. It is interesting that the National Museum of Ethnology was chosen as it houses collections gathered during the late colonial period. The exhibition was conceived and coordinated by Isabel Castro Henriques, a historian and prominent figure in Portuguese academia, who has consistently called for the critical examination of the colonial past and historical presence of Africans in Portugal. The project was based on clear principles to present the driving forces of Portuguese colonialism in Africa during the 19th and 20th centuries, to deconstruct the myths perpetuated by colonial ideology, to decolonize contemporary perceptions, and to provide an educational resource on colonialism. The project coordinators invited researchers from various disciplines, including history, anthropology, and cultural studies, to form the scientific community. These researchers were responsible for writing tests on topics related to propaganda, colonial oppression, forced labor, and resistance. The project was also sponsored by research centers linked to universities, archives, foundations, museums, and private funds. This initiative is also significant because it is one of the first times that a museum institution in Portugal has adopted the term decolonize in the title of an exhibition and its curatorial mission. I was invited to join the scientific committee of the exhibition and prepare text for the thematic panels. Each specialist would be free to conduct their research and write their test as they wished. No guidelines were provided, so each author could include their own perspective. Since different people would participate, a variety of voices and perspectives could emerge, which could be enriching. This diversity was ensured by the fact that the authors came from different disciplinary areas and generations and had different experiences. Some had already visited territories in Asia and Africa and South America, while others had more limited experience in this respect. The exhibition also included films and various objects, some of which were placed in display cases and were part of the National Museum of Ethnology's collection in Lisbon. According to Isabel Castro Henriques, the exhibition's organizer, the integration of these objects sought to highlight the political and creative force of African cultures, contradicting derogatory European narratives about Africa. In addition to these objects, the exhibition also features contemporary African artworks by artists such as Lívio de Moraes, Hilaire Balu, and Mónica de Miranda. The artists were invited to create pieces that would engage in dialogue with the chosen ethnographic artifacts and contribute to the decolonization of imaginations. From the beginning, there was a desire of internationalization, and the authors were informed that all texts, as well as the captions and identification of the materials, should be written in Portuguese and English. So in this case, internationalization means to write in English, the language that we are also using today. In practical terms, 25 April 1974 was the first day of freedom from the 48-year dictatorship in Portugal. This date also marked the end of the colonial war and the emancipation of African countries, which were formerly colonies and later overseas provinces. However, the colonial context and the period that followed were characterized by distinct experiences and perspectives on these events, such as the nature of colonialism, the colonial war, and the arrival of the returnees, the settlers, mainly from the settlement colonies in Angola and Mozambique. For some in Portuguese society, this anniversary was a time to celebrate the freedom gained in the metropolis. However, this freedom was also achieved through the armed resistance and liberation movements formed in Africa. These movements organized themselves in former Portuguese colonies and neighboring countries to keep some headquarters and party structures out of the reach of the PIDE. It was the political policy of the Estado Novo regime that was a dictatorship. For researchers with a more critical view of history, Afro-Descendants Association and anti-racist activists, this commemoration was a moment to advocate for genuine democratic progress. The colonial war, which lasted from 1961 to 1974, remains one of the most profound and least understood traumas in contemporary Portuguese history. For 13 years, the Estado Novo regime mobilized hundreds of thousands of young Portuguese men for a war intended to maintain the illusion of a pluricontinental empire. In Portuguese collective memory, the war is often recounted through the lens of the suffering of young metropolitan soldiers, family separation, and the psychological trauma of returning home. However, decolonizing our thoughts requires us to change our perspective and face the brutal truth about the violence, the colonialism, and this colonialism, the way it is inflicted on African communities. These included deliberate massacres, the use of chemical weapons such as napalm, a policy of reordering that displaced entire populations for military control, and the complete denial of citizenship to those with the indigenous status, so the Estatuto de Indígena. Thus, the exhibition at the National Museum of Ethnology sought to break the institutional silence surrounding some of these issues by presenting the violence of the war not as an accidental deviation, but as the inevitable result of a colonial system that refused to accept the course of history and the inevitability of African independence. Another element is the phenomenon of the so-called returnees. Between 1974 and 1976, approximately 500,000 Portuguese citizens residing in Africa returned in mass to Portugal in the wake of the decolonization and independence processes. This influx of people, one of the largest migratory movements in post-war Europe in proportion to the resident population, was absorbed by the young Portuguese democracy. The traumas are still numerous, and several authors, especially in the fields of anthropology and history, have explored these aspects of memory associated with colonialism. We can mention Elsa Peralta, Margarida Calafate Ribeiro, Miguel Cardina, and Morgane Apolline Delano, for example. The term retournee encompasses an identity complexity. Many were second or third generation colonists who had never set foot on European soil and whose lives were suddenly cut short. For many of these individuals and their families, decolonization was experienced as a betrayal by the metropolis, fueling a narrative of loss and nostalgia for colonial daily life that is often sanitized under the guise of the Lusotropicalist myth. The book published alongside the exhibition, which serves as its catalog, is divided into thematic sections. Each of the 7 sections contains 3 or 4 texts written by different authors to ensure a diversity of perspectives. The book begins with an introduction entitled Good Portuguese Colonialism, which critically deconstructs the Lusotropicalist thesis by demonstrating that the narrative of supposedly gentle and fraternal colonization was an ideological construct designed to mask oppression. Section 1, titled We Have Been in Africa for 500 Years, critically analyzes the myth of the antiquity and continuity of Portuguese territorial dominion. It shows that effective occupation of the African interior only began in the late 19th century and was military weak. In Section 2, Civilizing Mission and Progress, the authors analyze the Eurocentric rhetoric of material and moral progress, constructing it with the reality of economic exploitation and the deconstruction of local social structures. Section 3, under the theme Colonial Vocation and Historical Mission, examines how the state and institutions, including the church, constructed a mystical narrative about Portugal's imperial destiny in order to legitimize colonial domination. Section 4, the others, savage, the ghost, savage, and us, civilized, focus on the dynamics of otherness and the production of scientific racism. It demonstrates how anthropology and colonial administration categorize African peoples in order to justify their legal and social subjugation. Section 5, Portuguese Africa, analyzes imperial cartography and the efforts to nationalize overseas territories by erasing pre-existence and identities, language, and cultures. Section Sixth, the nation's greatness and the armed struggle confront the glorification of the empire in propaganda with the inevitable emergency of colonial wars and national liberation movements. Finally, Section 7, Decolonization, Independence and the Legacies of Colonialism, concludes the work by discussing the complexities of the post-1974 period and the persistence of colonial structures in contemporary Portugal. Translating the extent and density of the book's texts into the physical space of the exhibition presented complex museographic challenges. The exhibition space functions as a device for visual and material confrontation. Some objects from the colonial period, such as masks, statuary, work tools, or photographs, are displayed in juxtaposition with panels that explicitly show the violence of their acquisition trajectories. The physical space reveals the tension between the desire to decolonize the imagination and the political reluctance to progress with material decolonization, which would entail the effective restitution of heritage to its countries of origin. The public reception of this exhibition is an indicator of the current issues in Europe and in the world, as it prompts different perspectives on colonial history. Some sectors of society, including Afro-descendant associations, anti-racist activists, and critical historians, saw the exhibition as a long-awaited opportunity to reflect on colonial trauma and make historical reparations by including historical content that had been excluded from textbooks and official discourse. Additionally, the exhibition provided an opportunity to discuss the restitution of artifacts and human remains to their countries of origin. However, the reaction from other sectors of society was negative. Some articles published in newspapers and blogs, as well as social network comment sections became ideological battlegrounds. The exhibition was labeled as an attack on national identity, a concession to woke movements imported from abroad, a manifestation of national self-flagellation, and an insult to the history of ancestors by the more conservative sectors and the radical right, which currently enjoys considerable parliamentary representation in the Portuguese Assembly. In a tone of defensive victimhood, it was argued that present generations could not be blamed for past events and that the exhibition would only incite revolt among certain social groups and promote racial division in an otherwise peaceful country. This hostility is neither an isolated case nor a Portuguese idiosyncrasy. Rather, it is part of a broader European geopolitical situation characterized by the rise of far-right movements and parties across the continent. These political forces feed on the reactivation of historical myths, cultural polarization, and demonstrations that incite hatred against migrant and Afro-descendant populations. The exhibition challenges the myth of Lusotropicalism, a thesis originally proposed by Gilberto Freire, a Brazilian sociologist, in the 1930s and 1940s. This myth was embraced by the dictatorship as it was useful for maintaining the Portuguese colonial system. However, the idea that the Portuguese have a special attitude for integrating with colonized peoples has not disappeared and continues to circulate. Located in the National Museum, the exhibition is reluctant to take definitive action on the issue of heritage restitution. On the other hand, although the scientific committee included people from different disciplines, it still comprises a majority of intellectuals integrated into the Portuguese national academic system. In this scenario of polarization and hostility, we must ask what the role of cultural institutions, the social sciences, and the humanities should be. Confronting this hostility is a way to advance historical justice. However, this confrontation must be intelligent. We must avoid reducing to a dichotomy between oppressors, the former colonizers, and passive victims, the formerly colonized, as it removes the historical agency of colonized peoples who resisted in multiple ways. We should ask questions such as, which objects fill our national museums? Who has the legal and moral right to tell the stories of African countries, such in a public space in Lisbon? How can we translate museographic language so that it ceases to be a colonizer's monologue and becomes a polyphony? Decolonizing knowledge requires various forms of collaboration through transdisciplinary research. While anthropology may have an important role to play, it needs the contribution of other disciplines, practices, and forms of knowledge. Anthropology is well placed to do this, given its significant historical role in the colonial context, where it has produced differences and contributed to the implementation of power. We might say that in some cases, anthropology collaborated with the political administration of the colonies. For example, when some physical anthropologists were studying the supposed different human races and measuring people to analyze physical abilities of the people who would be sent to forced labor, an expression used to describe the practice of slave labor after the abolition of slavery, officially in all territories in 1869. But this changed, mainly after the Second World War, when the concept of race was contested and anthropologists started to be on the forefront of the critique of colonization and its practices, often carried out based on the idea that colonization have a civilizing mission. We cannot change the past, but we can assume that we do not have any compromise with its errors and mistakes, and we can do several things, the right things or the right change, in the words of Edward Said, in the present and in the future. I'm referring to the book Representations of the Intellectual, where Said in 1994 mentioned that nothing, in my view, is more reprehensible than those habits of mind in the intellectual that induce avoidance, that characterize turning away from a difficult and principled position which you know to be the right one, but which you decide not to take. One of the things that we can do is to assume this history and incorporate it in the curricula of high schools and universities. Museums also have an important role in contextualizing the histories of several collections of objects and human remains. Anthropology is known as the discipline that makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange. We often reject what is unfamiliar to us because we don't know it and because we fear it might be harmful. While we don't consciously adhere to this principle, it's a significant aspect of human nature that we tend to avoid or distance ourselves from what we don't know, often as a form of self-defense. I believe it is important to educate people to value difference and recognize diversity as a source of richness rather than a threat. This awareness raising process should begin earlier in schools for children and young people, and not only in universities. It is our intellectual responsibility to act in various fields, such as research centers and scientific societies, as well as artist context, visual arts, music, and sports, and in everyday life. And in this process, anthropology, in dialogue with other disciplines in a transdisciplinary way, can contribute to the recognition of the importance of diversity. Diversity is a richness and not a threat. A global and plural society would benefit from this recognition. This process should involve communities in a bottom-up manner. Based on some of these examples, I edited the book Decolonizing Europe with my colleague Livio Sanson. It included examples from various countries in Europe and beyond, from Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Kurdistan, Lithuania, and also Belgium. I propose a set of practical guidelines based on the Portuguese case. Firstly, museum governance policies must be reformulated, shifting the focus from exclusive national tutelage to international and transcontinental co-curatorship with researchers, artists, and communities. Secondly, the social sciences and the higher education system must undertake a review of their curricula, integrating knowledge produced in the Global South. It is important that students, whether in Lisbon, Paris, or London, read Amilcar Cabral, Gayatri Spivak, or Akil Membe with the same rigor and centrality with which they read European classics. These contributions must, however, be epistemologically contextualized in such a way that they effectively promote dialogue on both sides. Thirdly, museums must embrace transparency as an ethical standard. This could be publication of the detailed origin of each piece, the conditions under which it was acquired, and any acts of violence or dispossession associated with its entry into the institution. Finally, it is important to utilize the counter-hegemonic potential of literature and artistic language. Where possible, some levels should be translated into the original languages of the exhibit objects. So, to conclude, the process of decolonizing thought and practices is one of the most important discussions of our century. It is not an ephemeral academic trend or a rhetoric. The exhibition that I analyzed shows that the far-right forces have already recognized the importance of this discussion. They know that controlling the past validates contemporary structures of exclusion, control of migration, and denial of full citizenship rights to minorities. The social sciences and anthropology can propose inclusive, collaborative, and reparative practices, such as sharing curatorial power, decolonizing academic curricula, and integrating a polyphony of voices from Asia, Africa, and their diaspora. By doing that, it will be possible to transform the museum from an archive of colonial domination into a living space of historical justice. Literature can also play a very important role in this process. The exhibition catalog featured book covers by Castro Sormanho, a journalist, fiction writer, and ethnologist who won 3 awards in the field of Angolan literature in the 1930s and 1940s. Thank you for your patience and for actively listening. I'm happy to share my perspectives and contribute to the knowledge sharing opportunities provided by this 3rd International Conference of the World Association of Authors and Researchers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful session. Your lecture, along with the PPT presentation, have helped us to comprehend decolonization very easily. Learning decolonization thought with the reference of Portuguese case was indeed something very interesting. And it has helped us to widen our horizon of knowledge on post-colonial studies along with anthropology. It has helped us to understand this. And with your reference of theorists like Edward Said, Foucault, Derrida, and Spivak, has made this session more interesting and engaging. So I thank you on the behalf of all the listeners for this engaging and interesting session. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Now I want to welcome our next speaker and the chairperson of this plenary session, Professor David Webster. Professor David Webster is the professor of philosophy and pedagogy and senior advisor in pedagogy and practice at Buckinghamshire, New University, United Kingdom. He is an experienced philosopher writing on Buddhist philosophy and a range of other subjects. David is also National Teaching Fellow and academic leader focusing on inclusive pedagogy, ethics in AI, and religious studies. Today, he has joined us for his session on the topic Who Gets to Know? Literature, AI, and the Ethics of Decolonial Education. We are welcoming you, sir, on this platform to share your engaging views about this particular topic. The platform is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the invite to speak today. Hopefully, can you see my PowerPoint okay?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you. I'm going to try and get us back ever so slightly on time. Those two papers were so interesting and so full of rich detail. I've written down so many things I want to go and read about and follow up on. So that's hugely exciting and interesting. I'm going to take an ever so slightly different angle in that I'm going to talk about some of the practicalities of decoloniality in an educational context. So I was really interested by Professor Matos talking in the Portuguese context about pushback or negative reactions to decolonial content in museums. I'm in a way going to talk about some of the, it's not the opposite problem, but it's an inverse of that, which is when universities and educators say they're doing decolonial practice, say they want to have more ethics and social justice in their curriculum, but in practice, it's very much domesticated or toned down or incorporated into what already exists in existing hierarchy. So I think that's the kind of angle I want to take, and then think about how our classroom, lecture hall, seminar room practices have an impact on how we work. So I want to think about that, but also I want to do so in the context of thinking about literature and teaching of literature as well as philosophy, and what that can do to disrupt some of this domestication of decolonial intent. I want to think this question that you might be able to read on the slide, but I'll read out anyway, which says, when a student asks an AI system what a novel means, what a book means, whose knowledge answers them? They get an answer back that says, this is what this book means, this is what The Great Gatsby means. We talk about classic European literature earlier on, but what does it mean? But when a student asks an AI system, they come home and ask ChatGPT or Claude or one of these things, what does it mean, this book? I've read a book, what does it mean? Who's answered them? Whose answer are they then looking at? I think it's an interesting question, because no identifiable one person has answered. And that's both an, as I say in the slide, an ethical and epistemic problem. Normally, when somebody tells us the meaning of a novel or makes a claim about the meaning of a novel, say, we know who they are. We can probably have a guess at what their view might be informed by. You might say, well, my professor thinks this about this novel, but he's a man, he's got he perhaps misses some of the issues from a woman's perspective that are in the second part of the book. He is this age and perhaps has these perspectives. You know, we can think quite a lot about the situation, the situated nature of the knower, and when they offer us their critique, analysis, understanding of the meaning of a book, we know the context, we know who the knower is in that sense. When I ask ChatGPT, what does this book mean? What is the meaning of this novel? What ideas are being transmitted? It's not an individual knower. It's conglomerate, if that's the right word. It's a kind of mashing together, a less tidy word, of all the different views other people may have had. As I say in the slide, the response is generated from patterns in unequally available texts. Most of the training materials for large language models like ChatGPT, a vast proportion of them are in English, talking about them, reminds us of our very first paper, the kind of linguistic nature of many colonial practices, and the linguistic kind of hangover of colonialism, which we still see today in the training of large language models. So the response, the knower, is one who is trained on English texts predominantly, and in it offering to us a view of what does this book mean, the sources, disagreements, the complexity, the mess of literature, for example, and the conditions of its production, how did it come to its view, are obscured, it's opaque. Often those tools, we will no doubt all have some familiarity with them, speak with an authority they don't deserve. They speak with an authority of all the people who come and have their material summarily ripped off to produce that. But we don't know who the speaker is. We can't question them. They're not, although they present themselves as chatbots, they're not truly dialogical in that sense. There's no discourse one can have with them. Nobody appears, as I say, as answerable when we use that with students, when students use them. And now I want to come to how people use terms around decolonizing in university context, certainly in the UK, and I've seen this in replicated in other international contexts as well. People often use the phrase decolonizing the curriculum as a way of doing that. And they talk about we need to decolonize the curriculum. Can everybody go and change their reading lists, change their module content to offer more writers in the global south, more women, whatever the deficit is seen as being within a piece of educational provision. But that treats decolonizing as a process as rather cosmetic, as if you just need to add some things to your reading list and you can tick it off the list as one thing done. It's evidence that we've covered a culture, because I've taken I had a very traditional philosophy module, and all the writers I proposed were dead white European men. I think, well, that's awful. I want to decolonize my module. I should put some writers from the global south, some non-white writers on it, some women on it, and that did it. But that's not good enough. That's just cosmetic. That's just tinkering at the edges. It might make me feel better. It might make my administrator feel better, because they can say, look, David's module's been decolonized. He's completed the tick list that shows his reading lists, and his content now has a broader reach. But I need to do more than that. I need to do better than that. I need to do more than just add texts. I need to think, does my work now in the module, does the work we're doing really reorganize the intellectual center of the course? Have I shifted the real content, the questions that I'm asking students to consider? Are we not just looking at different answers, but we're undermining what they think the issues are in this? Am I treating the other sources as theoretical and having the same gravity, the same weight, the gravitas? Or are they just illustration? Are they just some extras, some nice to have add-ons to a curriculum which is still very colonial in many respects? Do students just look at these decolonial texts and say, oh, here's the message of them. This one tells us this one tells us that. That's not treating them as literature. It's not treating them as theoretical critical engagements, because students need to encounter non-colonial texts as polyvocal and difficult, not just as bearers of a message. And it's all too easy, I think, when people are writing about or putting in practice a less colonial approach to their educational practice, to just add a few extra messages in that they think makes it look like they're taking these things seriously. That's it. Unless students encounter the difficulty, the complexity, and the nuance, and the many-voiced nature of decolonial and non-Western texts, they're not really engaged with them at all. But I want to come on to this point, which I've previewed quite a bit. I think I've kind of begun to hint this is a direction of travel, what I was going to say today. But what I've seen really happen in certainly in British universities, and I've read about it further afield as well, that institutions often domesticate decolonisation. Universities think it's a good thing. They would like to advertise that they are very conscious of decolonisation, they take it seriously. That Britain, deeply colonial nature, we were talking before about stolen artefacts, and I'm thinking, I couldn't help but think of the British Museum, where I used to work, almost next door to it. And so, you know, Britain is very much an institution, a country that, at least for some intellectuals, people are conscious of the colonial past, and they want to be seen to be offering some form of response to that. So institutions like decolonisation, they like to be seen to be doing it. I've got to let my cat out. But what institutions often do is they don't want to do things that are difficult. They don't want to do things that are expensive. So they often end up in practice having rather thin, poor processes that, as I say, domesticate decolonisation. A curriculum, as I state here, can become more diverse in appearance at a surface level while preserving the same hierarchy of who's important, what questions get to be asked, and how knowledge is curated. So you get things which are genuine, serious, ethical questions, intellectual questions about what matters in philosophy and medicine. And what matters, not just what the answer should be, what questions should even be asked, what is the nature of different kind of philosophical queries. So we have all this, but these things become often through institutional decolonisation initiatives domesticated. They become an annual workflow. Have you filled in the section on your annual report that asks you about decolonisation? I note here 3 possible ways in which this can be undertaken. Often it will point at staff and say, look, your module, your course, your program is insufficiently representative, or doesn't sufficiently represent the global south non-male scholars. They can name representation of the problem, but then goes on to make that a very kind of manageable process through content review. Can I look at your module and see what's on it? And that process, as I said in the previous slide, leaves issues of authority, issues of methodological practice, and importantly for students, because this is what they often really care about, issues of assessment untouched, unchanged, and not really decolonialised at all. But with some thought to the topic today and the nature of the organisation, that's the World Organisation of Authors and Researchers, brought us here today, and the topic for the conference. The topic for the conference has a real strong focus on literature, on writing as a possible way into thinking about how we do this kind of practice that's more genuinely disturbing to these kind of hierarchies. Because in works of literature, there is much more room for nuance and complexity and conflict than in many more texts. So I'm just kind of talk about how literature can give form to situated, embodied, historically located knowledge. So when students encounter and read books, I see if one person's having a view with the problem with the sound, I'll keep talking on the presumption that the sound's okay. Okay, sounds still okay, Matthew? Okay, I'll keep talking, though it's on the slide as well. Is that reading within novels can give us complicated, difficult characters who we can do something with, which is more than taking them as representations of their culture. Thank you, Cheikh. So we can take characters as disagreeing with each other, as not saying mere ciphers for the culture they come to represent, and it resists the this fantasy that every meaning is transparent, universal, and easily paraphrased, because good literature is not like that. It's intrinsically difficult. It demands attention to voice, form, science, ambiguity, and it prevents the idea that cultures other than our own are univocal. Now, we know they're not in practice, and yet in practice, often when people are trying to add things to the curriculum. Oh, I'll add a perspective from this culture's point of view, as if a culture has just one point of view, which can be bolted on in that way. And literature is particularly well placed to disturb or undermine that kind of rather lazy approach to thinking about decolonisation. Move on to that. Thinking again, when we return back to our thinking about AI a couple of slides ago, that will give us, as I say, we want to know what's the view of this knowledge. What's the view? What's the situated nature of the writer? What's going on in it? We get a plausible answer from the AI tool, as we spoke about. But I say that leaves us without the ability to interrogate the historicity and the kind of location and the cultural factors that impact on that verdict. Genuine dialogical engagement entails these relations of trust, authority, and responsibility, and remains open to challenge and request for justification. That entire area is absent. That entire route towards a kind of epistemic understanding is closed off in an AI tool. So we want to think very strongly, and it's been a theme in the papers today, about who is heard, what can be understood, what can be said, who can be understood. And in the kind of limited way we've talked about things like AI tools so far, that is an avenue that is closed off to us and made impossible. Now, I don't want us to take the view that thinking about artificial intelligence tools and large language models is the only problem. That I arrived in a university that was otherwise brilliant. The universities were all already doing great work on decolonizing the curriculum, restoring epistemic justice, and the AI has come along and disrupted that. I don't want us to think that, because it's not true. Universities were already deeply problematic, hierarchical, power-led, often colonial in form, and if not just in content as well, institutions, before we have the advent of the last few years of more usable, free-to-use AI models. We'd already had in curriculums within universities methods of assessment, processes, like they rewarded performance over thinking. They rewarded fluent outputs that didn't really have strong reading, strong judgment in them. So we already had kind of issues and problems within the university, and access is the problem. So I don't want to kind of make us think with the universities with some kind of ethical epistemic paradise prior to their invasion by AI in that sense. Because that doesn't reflect the knowledge of those of us who remember universities prior to that. I think this is pretty much all of us. And in fact, if you take a certain perspective on these concerns, you'll say actually the worries and the anxieties that AI brings along with it is genuine. It's not just about cheating, but it's also about worries about academic integrity. It also really brings out in really sharp contrast questions of authority, about where knowledge is taken from, who has it, and issues of power. So that these questions are ones that we should be thinking about anyway. They just might end up being kind of framed somewhat differently in this context. The way it becomes different in that context that I wanted to phrase here was around the idea of a kind of a compression of knowledge. So when you ask ChatGPT, you ask Claude, you ask Gemini, to help you with something, there is this epistemic compression where many voices become the answer, rather than having to trawl through lots of voices, taking a pile of books you take home from the library, or an equivalent, pile of PDFs you download, but a variety of them. And for each one, you know something about the context of the person who's written it. Who's written this? Okay, that's a scholar from the 19th century. This is a scholar who worked in this country and they studied here. This is all compressed into one answer, but those many voices have somehow been wrangled or compressed into. So, and the style, in a sense, is a stylistic compression. or a curation or an attempt to make all of those many styles, many kind of meaning-based voices all speak the same way. Many of us will begin to recognize AI type writing. If you ever go on LinkedIn to connect with what's on there, you find it seems to me about 2/3 of the posts appear to be written with AI, at least. I'm perhaps missing some of the others. So that it kind of flattens the style out as well and introduces certain stylistic, rhetorical tricks that are actually really repetitious and ultimately quite tedious, rather than being something that makes us think and conveys meaning. And of course, what often happens in AI summaries of novels, particularly literature, but also more broadly other kinds of intellectual work, is that it brings it makes conflicts the kind of synthesis. It tamps it down to there are two sides to this, and if you want 3 points in favor of A and 3 points in favor of B, it'll give you that. But it doesn't really, it doesn't capture the phenomenological texture of conflict in a book or in a set of ideas. It wants to flatten it as it does with tone, the same kind of civilized conversation or possible interpretations. And in that, there is something fundamentally lost that falls away from that. I'm just conscious on time, so 5 minutes or so. And I didn't think I'd find myself, as a non-Catholic, quoting the Pope today, but he wrote, of course, Magnificat Humanitas, which some of you will have seen earlier this year. Despite some conflicts of interest with Anthropic, he made a statement on AI, which I just want to quote one line from. It's very long, as these encyclicals are, these papal encyclicals, but there's one line I want to quote, which is that technology is never neutral because which we're very conscious of, but the latter half of the sentence is interesting. It's because it takes on the characteristics of those who devise, finance, regulate, and use it. And I think we kind of know this, but in working with our students, it's something we can't remind them of often enough. That these tools are there to make a profit. They're there to make certain companies successful, and they've been done using a very particular, very biased, very prejudicial, ethically questionable set of processes. You know, if you were being controversial, you might say these tools are kind of forms of predatory capitalism that seek to kind of take knowledge from the commons and then sell it back to people in exchange for premium model versions that allow better answers for better off people, for more wealthy people. So in a sense, it isn't a question of whether we think artificial intelligence is helpful to our conversations about decoloniality and education. It's whether we think the artificial intelligence that we've currently got in the world, that's currently available to us as a result of the investment from very specific people for very specific types of artificial intelligence, whether that's helpful. And that seems quite a different question. It's not about whether you are in favor or not in favor of technology, but what kind of technology we have and what will the consequences of that be. And some of the things we've seen today, I think, implicate some of the answers to that in relation to thinking about decoloniality, but of course thinking about literature as well, particularly. Now, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for a discussion because there's loads of other things that I think people know want to ask about the previous two papers. There's one phrase I want to briefly mention, and then I'm going to skip to the last slide in the next couple of minutes. But one of the phrases that you may well have heard a lot, and I hear a lot of people expressing concern about, is at a time when we really want students to be thinking in different ways. We want to really challenge their thought, and this is a lot of the work that previous two colleagues have been talking about in terms of getting students to think about the conditions of production for the literature they're reading, to think about whose works they're not reading, think about what languages things are being read in. We want students to think more broadly and deeply on these things. At the same time, we encounter significant anxiety. The students are thinking hardly at all. And this phrase sort of tries to capture that, which is that of cognitive offloading. where students might outsource more than just grammar checking, but outsource summary, interpretation, comparison, and yet still hand in things that are polished. They wanted to bypass the very processes of attention, judgment, and revision that colleagues at this event and in relation to themes want them to do more of. So we've got to think, well, of course, there've been events there before, but how we work with students to ensure that it still cultivates these fundamental habits of thought and processes that we think are important. Now, 2 or 3 more things I want to say about that in practice. But I'd say when thinking about the last couple of things I want to think about really in the last 90 seconds or so, I'd say that the university is not there to train students to be able to produce polished outputs. That was a function of how it used to work, but they were always an analog for something else. But they're not there to make them, give them a frictionless ability to produce polished outputs. The university's real goal for philosophers, for people in literature and beyond, is to make the conditions of knowing visible and contestable. What is known? How is it known? Who claims to know it? How can we argue about this? Do I know enough about this subject to engage in it? How can I find that out if I don't already? And that's where I say that literature can have a particular role in teaching us to remain within a plurality of voices, within an area that is difficult, complicated, polyvocal, and intentionally opaque and complex. And if I use Khair to some extent might deepen that account, that's fine. But what we really worry about is both for ourselves and for those who we have the privilege of teaching, we shouldn't automate that away from them, and we should give them the opportunity to develop the skills that we have, at least to some extent, hopefully developed ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this appealing and informative session on literature, AI, and ethics of decolonial education. The most engaging part, as per my part, was how institutions domesticate decolonization. Additionally, the session also helped us to understand the link of generative AI and the relation of epistemic compression. I thank you, sir, for this insightful session, and the presentation of PPT actually helped us a lot to understand things. Now I want to open question answer session with our present guest speaker, Professor David and Professor Patrícia. Kindly keep yourself muted until you are asked for. Those who are prepared with their questions are requested to raise your hands first, and then we'll ask your name and please unmute them. Raise your hand, one who wants to ask questions from our guest speakers.
Mansi, Mr. Senthil Kumaran, he is there. So you can see those who are raising hands. Yeah, you can tell them to ask questions. Senthil is there. He wants to ask questions.
Yes, so please, Senthil, you can proceed with your questions. Unmute yourself. You have not unmuted yourself. Kindly check your mic first.
I'm not sure if that was just a question just for me or whether for the other members of the panel as well, but certainly the section I heard, the sound wasn't great then, was about the kind of societal nature, I think, of kind of colonialism. I think in different societies it's constructed, of course, very differently. I very much from the first paper, I think the idea that, we see today, we're all here speaking from all over the world, speaking in English. The colonial legacy of the UK in terms of its language remains dominant that way, but the way in which universities are organized as kind of colonial organization in terms of the hierarchy and exactly how that works, and the very deeply embedded forms of privilege and authority that sit within them and who gets to speak, and those kind of presuppositions about how institutions of knowledge should be organized seem to be prevalent in many countries. They're very strong in some universities more than others. If you go down the road from me 40 miles to somewhere like Oxford, you'll find that there is so conventional and so hierarchical and so exclusive of those that don't fit through its doors in a certain way, that I think the influences of kind of those kind of hierarchies of power are visible in so many different ways and in so many different institutions. I leave it to other people from the panel to add their responses on that same topic.
We are waiting for more questions. Anyone who is interested to ask questions on the sessions that we have taken so far, kindly raise your hand first.
Hello, may I take the floor?
Yes, sir. Sure.
Thank you very much. My name is Cheikh from Senegal, the University of Saint Louis. I really appreciate the panel. It's very rich and very interesting, very engaging, both all the three speakers. So my concern is really about the debate over whether Africa should adopt an African language as a Pan-African lingua franca, or often framed too narrowly as a choice between linguistic decolonization and the continued dependence on European languages. So in my view, this binary overlooks more difficult questions. Which African language, which variety, which writing system, because the writing system hasn't been addressed in the debates here. Who determines its standard form and whose knowledge does that standard privilege? At which scale? From the national scale first, as promoted by Frantz Fanon, sub-regional, regional, and then finally continental, where to start? So my question is to the panelists, especially to my colleague and friend, Dr. Cheikh Nguirane, and the other panelists also can intervene if they like. Can a Pan-African language project be genuinely decolonial before African states develop multilingual institutions that reconcile competing languages and scripts? The word scripts is very important because we had Arabic script inherited from Islam. We had the Latin-based script most recently, and we have African created script like the Nko, which tries to write to help write Manding languages in Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, etc. So, how to reconcile these competing languages and scripts, and also recover non-European archives, transform curricula, and protect smaller linguistic communities. So there is this is the question I have, because also I don't agree 100% on the statement by Ngugi when he said 90% of African language, African body of scholarship is written in European languages. I think this overshadows a great swath of African knowledge base written in African languages using Ajami or Arabic script. So this is the question. I can reformulate it. Can a Pan-African language project be genuinely decolonial before African states develop multilingual institutions that reconcile competing languages and scripts, recover non-Europhone archives, such as the body of knowledge in Timbuktu, in Pirsa Nyohor, and others, written in Tuba, Koki, written through the Arabic script, transform curricula, because that also is part of the process, not just the language itself, but the content of the language, as advocated by Edward Blyden and others, and protect also smaller linguistic communities, because they also have their rights in the public space. So once again, thank you. I really appreciate your input.
May I take the floor?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Cheikh Tidiane Lo. So you raise a lot of questions that are central to the debate in language, in Pan-Africanism. And you ended up quoting I would say, Edward Wilmot Blyden. So Blyden defended Arabic. He defended Arabic as a language that should be adopted as the Pan-African language. Blyden traveled all over the world. He went to Palestine, he visited Cote d'Ivoire, he visited Senegal, and he was comparing many colonial systems. And he was, I would say, in contradiction in his writings. He was defending British colonialism. When he visited Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, he ended up saying the colonial French system is better. And he was also convinced that Arabic, based on his knowledge of Islam, was better to suit the connections of African people. That's what he defended. That is the Tombouctou school. I have read a few works defending that. But my colleague also raised one important point that is still going on. That is, what language should we choose? Some scholars raised the concern that it might become a reverse domination. One of the African languages to be chosen would be taking over and putting in place some hegemonic dynamics that has been demonstrated all over. And Swahili, mostly spoken in, I would say, East Africa. What about West Africa? What about North Africa? That is another question. And Ali Mazrui, he rejected the lingua franca. I would say he rejected the indigenous languages being adopted in Pan-African arenas. He was defending English as being relevant enough to carry our messages and aspirations. That's what Ali Mazrui defended. But he was controversial, let's say that. He was even defending auto-recolonization, that we African countries colonize those countries that are failing. Also, he was saying English is enough for us to move on, because he was defending some kind of trans-Saharan Pan-Africanism. Trans-Saharan Pan-Africanism, that's what he was defending, rejecting anything that is essentialist. And he could not advocate for a single language. That is one aspect that I share with you. But also in terms of the competing languages, European languages, I would say, the competing European languages on the African continent, that is another question. And it has been raised not long ago within the African Association of the Canadian Association of African Studies, because it brought together Francophone and Anglophone speakers. The problem is the Anglophone speakers are dominating the association all over. They are not taking into account all the contribution from Francophone contributors. And now they started to restructure the association to include all of that. And there's a linguistic fight within the association, the same in the association that is based in the US. And what I can say is, in terms of education, adopting one single language is quite challenging. John Mara, that I mentioned in my talk, the book is entitled Pan-African Education, a Must for the African Union. He is not rejecting European languages. He is saying we should teach in English, in French, in Portuguese, in Spanish to have a meeting ground. Because he says there is knowledge stored in Spanish we don't know as Francophone. There is knowledge stored in English that we don't know as Francophone, but also there's knowledge in English that we don't know as other speakers. And for any unity to happen, we have to have that meeting ground first, using our colonial languages, appropriating the message, but also making sure that what they name is relevant to our realities. That is quite challenging. I agree with the position of using those colonial languages to name our realities. But Ngugi, I can understand that a lot of people do not agree with him when he says 90% of the messages are stored in European languages and that we have to do something else. Ngugi went further to say that only in African studies you can see someone who doesn't speak a single African language teaching and researching about Africa. Ngugi said that. Ngugi says, would you consider me teaching in a British university or French university without speaking one single language of that country? It is absolutely not possible, but it is possible in the other side. So Ngugi, the way I approach Ngugi is mostly based on his consciousness of how language can be dominant, how language can be embedded in some forms of imaginaries, but also subjectivities. That's how I approach Ngugi wa Thiong'o. But also, when I talk about Ngugi, I kind of rehabilitate Ngugi in the Pan-African tradition. He's most of the time not really named. Many people do not name Ngugi as a Pan-African. He is a Pan-Africanist. And they kind of rehabilitate that contribution from Ngugi, not just based on his novels, but also his latest publications. So to finish, I would say that the archives is still problematic in Pan-Africanism. One researcher we already know is Usman Khan. Usman Khan raised the issue for a very long time, studying Timbuktu. He was even like dividing researchers based on how the language they speak. He says we have in our African societies non-Europhone, those who have studied Arabic or other intellectual traditions that are not considered as intellectuals, because the language issue is still going on. And I hope that we would be adapting those languages to our own realities. That is, to me, practical. But having one single African language would be quite difficult unless we have some political background. There is no way we can achieve that.
Good, Dr. Nguirane, there are, excuse me, Dr. Nguirane, there are 1 minute, sorry. Yeah, excuse
Can I
me.
follow up with a comment?
Excuse me, yeah. So maximum, now we do not have more time. So
Yeah,
maximum two
thank you.
questions. Excuse me.
May I ask a question?
Excuse me, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
I say, may I ask a question?
Yes, please. So the maximum two questions can be taken. One by Dr. Ibrahim Sir and another by Dr. Mohammadou Sadio. So only two questions, please. Because we have to close the session at 5, within 15 minutes, because there is another session, valedictory. So we have only 15 minutes. So please make your questions very short, and we expect the speakers to make the answers short. Yes, please, Dr. Ibrahim.
Maybe. Thank you very much. I will go straight to my questions that I addressed to Dr. Nguirane. If a major African language were to be internationalized and promoted as a continent-wide lingua franca, would this not risk reproducing the same sense of alienation and foreignness that many Africans have historically experienced through the dominance of colonial language? Then last, how can Africa realistically free itself from linguistic reality that has become deeply embedded in the construction of its identity, its knowledge system, and its perception of the world? Thank you very much.
To be short, thank you so much to Dr. Sa for this question, and that really pushes me to look further to this challenging issue that is language in Pan-Africanism. The basis of my talk was really to consider how language has been excluded from the Pan-African scholarship. And it is quite clear that having a single African language is quite challenging. That is true. But also, when we choose one single African language, I see a comment from my former, I would say, IGB fellow, Nrao Fai, who says pragmatism would be the best way. Yeah, it can be. As a linguist, you can see that. But I approach the language issue from a historical perspective, because I studied the history of Pan-Africanism and also tried to see what are the main ramifications, and language having been one of them. But to choose one single language, it might follow the same process as the European languages, the same process. That is the problem and the concern, the risk of repeating the domination. And let me finish by quoting Frantz Fanon. He said the same. Frantz Fanon says, if we restructure our governance and our way of chairing our administration, and also we should not be doing it the same way the colonial countries, because when we choose that same process, we are repeating but also continuing that process, that risk being the country of what we were preaching. And that is quite clear when it comes to the language issue. And I hope that we can benefit from all the knowledge in different languages, but come up to name our realities in African agency. African agency can be expressed in many various languages, even if you do not adapt a single language. But Swahili, I'm convinced, can be a single African language.
Thank you so much, sir. Can we proceed with the next question?
Yeah, Dr. Muhammad Dao, please ask your question. Muhammad Dao, this is the last question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, now, yes, please.
All right. Thank you very much for having me here today. I would like, first of all, to warmly congratulate the University of Numeric Sheikh Hamidou Khan through the English department for successfully hosting this important international conference, bringing together scholars from around the globe, to discuss decolonizing through language and literature is a significant contribution to African global academic dialogue. So to Dr. Nguirane, I would like just to thank you for your insightful presentation. Your emphasis on the linguistic dimension of Pan-Africanism highlight and an aspect is too often overlooked. I have two brief questions since we are running out of the time. Give me 1 second. I have two brief questions. How can African University effectively promote linguistic Pan-Africanism while maintaining the international academic engagement? And the second question is, what practical strategies would you recommend to encourage greater scholars collaboration across African diverse languages? Thank you very much.
Sir, you are not audible to us. Please unmute yourself first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sajid, for the question that is so relevant. And I think this has to be the follow-up of this presentation, trying to find answers, not just focus on scientific contributions and so on. So African universities can promote African languages. There are initiatives all over the continent. And the latest initiative might be connected to the presentation of David Webster, that is AI. In South Africa, they're working to really embed African languages in AI, because AI being that network that does not include all the contribution, and it's not pluriversality, as we would say from a decolonial perspective. So African universities, if I am to say they should promote linguistic Pan-Africanism, it should be to allow those who have knowledges in different language systems to come to our spaces. It should not be only us, for us as academics. If we welcome those different voices that express our realities, it can be a way to open the debate for our African languages. It can be in poetry. We have local languages in poetry. And my colleague, Cheikh knows about that. There are many voices in Senegal, in other African countries that can express this is, well, I think I lost the connection. Sorry for that. Do you hear me?
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Do you hear me? Yeah, I was saying that we can welcome those voices that does not speak who do not speak English or French. They are poets, they are griots, they can tell stories within our academic spaces. That is one initiative that can be developed further and further. But at the same time, we have programs of learning our own languages. We have those programs at Cheikh University. I myself have studied Wolof. It's not enough, maybe, but if we continue to follow the steps of South Africa, that is doing great in promoting indigenous languages, even in the era of AI, that can be a promotion. But also within the African Union, there is a promotion of African languages within the African Union. But also we have to continue the tradition of the Asmara Declaration. The Asmara Declaration can be a good way to promote those languages. This is how I see it, but linguistic Pan-Africanism to me is more than just finding one single language. It is finding our voices, naming our realities, expressing our emotions, but also rejecting what is subjugated, what is oppressive, what is not emancipatory for our destiny. That's how I see it.
Thank you, sir. Now I want to invite Professor David again for concluding the session.
Thank you. I think you were asking me to do some concluding the session there. I lost you for a moment as well to technology. I'm just very quickly would like to thank my fellow guests for such fantastic papers and for really interesting questions. And of course, to the organisers, to Video and to yourself for such an amazing event and the opportunity to connect with so rich and diverse a range of speakers from so many different locations. I think this session has thrown up more questions than answers. And that is exactly how it should be. It should kind of deepen our thought on these kind of important issues. I think we've seen a real diversity and range of that. So on behalf of myself, and I think on the other two speakers, we'd like to thank the organisers hugely for the privilege for speaking to such a kind of engaged and interesting audience. If only every time we got to speak, we had such interesting questions, and we'd be very lucky. So that's all I wanted to really say that, and think we can hopefully we'll get opportunities to continue to have these conversations between ourselves, and thank you for this event, and with our colleagues back at our home universities as well, in a more informed way because of the things that we've now heard today and taken away from this event. So that's a huge thank you from both myself and my fellow guests, but to the organisers generally for giving us this opportunity for such a rich engagement. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now it's time to complete this session with the kind words of Joint Secretary of WAAR, Dr. Pradeep Kumar, who is currently teaching as an assistant professor in University of Allahabad. I request you, sir, to join this platform to deliver formal vote of thanks to our eminent guest speakers. The platform is yours.
Thank you, Mansi, for giving me this opportunity. Good morning, respected professors and all the participants. I, Dr. Pradeep Kumar, the Joint Secretary of the World Association of Authors and Researchers, WAAR, I would like to thank Professor David Webster for chairing this plenary session and also for his wonderful talk on the topic, Who Gets to Know Literature, AI, and the Ethics of Decolonial Education. Sir, thank you for your close observation and critical remarks as the chairperson and insightful suggestions. Next, I would also like to thank Dr. Cheikh Nguirane, who talked about Pan-African education and demanded for a linguistic unity in order to decolonize English studies in African countries. Thank you, sir, for your insightful talk. I would like to thank Professor Patrícia Matos, whose sagacious and discerning discussion on the exercises that are necessary for decolonization. She examined the past and present scenario of Portugal. She talked about the importance of the knowledge of social science in order to get rid of colonialism. Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful deliberation and extensive research. I also like to thank all the participants whose presence made this session enriched and wonderful. At the end of the plenary session, I would like to express my sincere gratitude towards the chapter directors of WAAR at Senegal and Prayagraj. I would like to thank our president of WAAR, Professor Vijay Kumar Roy sir, and Dr. Manish Kumar sir, Secretary of WAAR, and Dr. Yogeshwar Shah sir, for their effort to make this event successful. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The plenary session has completed and the valedictory session is about to be conducted. I request all the participants, all the joinees to be here and kindly connect us within 10 minutes of break.